This forest will always be permeated with prayer.
Ahead on Frontiers, a journey to Monk's Lagoon will show you why this is a sacred place in a sacred space for Orthodox Christians around the world.
Now people flock to this very forest, as hard as it is to get to be able to have the blessing of praying where he prayed.
He was the first Orthodox saint in North America. Why the life of St. Herman is full of surprises.
Art throughout most of Christian history has been used to tell the stories.
And another window into spirituality, how the beauty of stained glass has transformed a downtown Anchorage church.
Alaska, where there are old triumphs, but also new frontiers, with challenges as great as the state itself, but a belief the best is yet to come, bringing you the faces, the places, and the spirit of the last frontier. This is Frontiers with Rhonda McBride.
Welcome to Frontiers. Just about any exploration of Alaskan history involves religion, like the 10 Russian monks who arrived in Kodiak in 1794. George Washington was president that year, and Joseph Haydn wrote another symphony. But not long afterwards, one of the monks, Father Herman, left to Kodiak to make a new home near the modern-day community of Uzinki. Today, he is revered by Orthodox Christians as the first saint in North America. Not far from Kodiak, you'll find Spruce Island.
We're headed to Monk's Lagoon, but it is not easy to get to.
And we're about to find
We're about to find that out.
Even on nice days like this one,
You feel a little bit of a bump.
Father Innocent Dresdo must wrestle with the tides at Monk's Lagoon. He says it's like spirituality. It takes work.
We refer to it as an Aleut anchor.
Even though he's made this journey many times, it's always a struggle to anchor his raft offshore so it won't capsize.
Sometimes when the tide's just right, it takes the boat right out for you. You just have to be patient.
Father Innocent has a system, one anchor on the beach and a second one on the boat.
Now I just tug on it. Down goes the anchor. And as the boat moves, the anchor sets.
Much in the same way prayer was the anchor in St. Herman's life.
His goal was to live as a hermit. So he wanted to live in quiet solitude.
So he could pray for mankind. In the early 1800s, he arrived on these shores in exile because he made waves over the brutal treatment of Alaska natives by Russian fur traders. But even in isolation, he continued to champion their cause and found peace.
Right now we're listening to the ocean, the surf crashing. As we get up over the knoll in the forest, you can't hear the ocean anymore. And to have that kind of quiet stillness is one of the greatest blessings we can experience in life. And it's a beautiful and very humbling experience when your senses start to experience it. So the ears with the hearing, and then the smells change from sea smells to forest smells, and all our senses begin to just become more enlivened. And every time I come here, and I come over this little knoll, I'm reminded that I'm in control of nothing. And yet, God gives the abundance of life to us. And so, you can just breathe deeply, and we're here. There's security. There's calm.
A place where silence speaks, where pilgrims from all over the world come to seek inspiration.
This particular one's time for us to replace it. It's getting pretty faded. The main picture shows St. Herman in the forest.
The images that surround the monk tell the story of how he became known as the Wonder Worker, a man who cared for those swept up in an epidemic, who built an orphanage and schools for the children. People also speak of miracles when he used an icon of the Virgin Mary to stop a tidal wave, or how from his own hands he fed bears. Some pilgrims say you can hear the angels sing.
There'll be times when we're here and there's nobody else here. And they'll stop and they'll, did you hear that? No. And they'll start humming or singing with the choir.
A surprise awaits in the middle of the forest. A chapel built where Father Herman was buried. Is this the exact spot where he was buried?
That's right.
There's a small shrine under the church where pilgrims can kneel on a wooden board to pray.
And kneeling on the boards, even that part is important because St. Herman, for his blanket, used a board.
And stones for a pillow. Sacrifices this chapel pays homage to. Sacrifices the monk kept secret as part of his spiritual journey. But it's his passion for prayer which lives in the hearts of the faithful, a window into a world which cannot be seen, only felt. St. Herman washed and drank water from this very spring. It's very cold.
The beauty of a natural spring.
Some believe these waters have the power to heal, just like prayer. If Father Herman were alive today, what would he be praying for up here?
He would be praying that we would love God first and foremost, and that we would love one another. And that's why we talk in terms of, one of the reasons why we talk in terms of timeless. You know, we step out of time when we step into sacred space. And it's almost as if paradise is restored here. You know, it's a window into the glory of heaven.
Eternal light, Father Innocent says, versus the fading light of the sun. Father Herman died in 1837. When he was canonized as a saint in 1970, his remains were moved to the Holy Resurrection Cathedral in Kodiak. So what did it take for this monk to become a saint? Father Michael Oleksa is here with a story that takes some unexpected turns. Travel just a few miles by boat from Monk's Lagoon and you'll find Uzinki, a community made up of mostly Russian Orthodox believers who have a beautiful church to worship in, but no priest who lives there. The Kodiak Baptist Mission steps in to meet the community's spiritual needs in cooperation with the Orthodox Church, an arrangement the mission says is very unusual but works very well.
In the village, village life is the way, and subsistence is the way, and helping each other in a harsh environment is the way. And if faith is part of that, we can cooperate and come alongside each other and lift each other up.
The mission's work in Uzinki goes back to 1938. Today, the mission sponsors youth programs. Well, joining us now, Father Michael Oleksa, who has served for many years as a priest for the Russian Orthodox communities across Alaska, but he also teaches classes in cross-cultural education. And boy, I tell you, it seems like this is a cross-cultural experience. But, you know, a lot of times churches are known to compete with each other in small communities. So is this kind of a refreshing thing to see in Uzinki?
Yes, I think it is. In many cases, the Orthodox Church has been there for a century or more. Another group comes in and there's conflict or hostility to start with. But in the case of Uzinki, they've both been there long enough to get along.
Well, in Uzinki, they are very protective of Monk's Lagoon, which is nearby. And of course, you know, they're a little, it seems like they're a little skeptical of all the pilgrims that come to see Monk's Lagoon.
I'm not so sure it's the pilgrims themselves, but it's certainly people who come and try to stay longer. There have been incidents of people from the lower 48 coming and liking Monk's Lagoon well enough to build buildings there and act as if they owned the place. And of course, it is Alaska Native land, so we don't really need intruders from other parts of the world coming to squat on it.
Well, I probably should mention here that there's a convent and a monastery nearby.
Yes. They're not affiliated with the Orthodox Church in America, so we don't have much.
You don't have much contact with them.
That's right. And they're in isolated communities where they can be like St. Herman, pretty much on their own.
So tell us a little bit about the story of St. Herman. What is it that draws pilgrims to him?
I think people all over the United States, and in fact, Orthodox Christians from all over the world, from Greece, from Albania, from the Middle East, from Russia, come to experience the holiness of the place, as Father Innocent tried to infer in your video tour of Monk's Lagoon. There's a sense of holiness there that's palpable. It's a physical presence that almost anybody who set foot on the island can appreciate.
When I was there, you know, of course it's so beautiful. You cannot help but be moved, but I feel like there's also something else there.
There's a presence there that drew the Aleuts to Monk's Lagoon during Father Herman's life, and then continued to draw them after his death. In fact, most of his miracles occurred when people came to pray at his gravesite after he was buried in that cave at Monk's Lagoon.
Well, putting things in modern context, what do you think of those miracles that are told about him? You know, his feeding the wild beasts, that he could talk to the animals.
Well, there's records of many saints throughout Christian history doing those things, but the tidal wave story where he put an icon on the beach and the tidal wave didn't rise any higher than that, and the fire where he drew a line in the moss are the two recorded miracles during his lifetime. But I've known personally hundreds of people who have gone to Monk's Lagoon with various diseases, and even infants who were treated with the water brought home from the lagoon to their bedside and been cured. So they'll testify to the power of holiness that spreads from whatever touched Father Herman, the earth that covered his grave and the water that he blessed while he was still alive.
So one of the things about him is that you do not hear these stories about his activism. Now, how much of that exists in recorded history?
There are dozens of letters that he and the other monks wrote back to Russian authorities in Siberia and even St. Petersburg, appealing for redress for the criminal actions of Alexander Baranov and the Russian-American company during the 18 years that he was the virtual dictator on Kodiak Island. He impressed hundreds, if not thousands, of Kodiak Aleutic men into, I would call it, involuntary servitude. Slavery might be another word, and moved them to places like the Kuril Islands just north of Japan and as far south as Baja California. The Russian population in Alaska was never more than 800. So to get things done, he needed native labor. And so Baranov just enslaved people, extorted furs.
When the monks arrived, they reacted.
They reacted very negatively to this. The original American history books say that they reacted negatively because their house wasn't built or they didn't have enough food, and they were genteel aristocrats who weren't used to a frontier kind of life. But that's not at all the case. They reacted against Baranov because of his illegal and criminal treatment of Alaska Native people. And Father Herman spent his life writing appeals back to Russia, begging for redress, actually for even the arrest of Alexander Baranov. And Father Yosaf, the head of the mission, was given that authority and was returning to Kodiak to arrest Baranov, but his ship sank. And Baranov's regime lasted another 18 years.
But you know, there are stories of the schools he founded, the orphanages, and he did a lot of that from Monk's Lagoon.
Yes, he did all that at Monk's Lagoon. When there were epidemics that swept through the colony, Father Herman took the orphans home and cared for them. So he was a champion of Alaska Native people in many ways, and that's why they revered him as a saint during his life and built the chapel over his death on the centennial of his arrival in 1894. And then, because of their veneration, the church authorities ultimately in New York noticed and set aside a date to remember him, August the 9th.
Let's talk a little bit about his canonization, because that happened in Kodiak in 1970, more than 100 years after the fact.
That's right. The veneration of Father Herman as a saint was well documented by the 1890s. When they were building the chapel over his grave at Monk's Lagoon, the monastery back in Finland was collecting the letters and the diaries and the reports that had been filed with them over the decades. And so they compiled a book about his life, but it was in Russian. So then it had to be translated into English, and finally it caught on in America. We've got a saint here in Alaska.
So it just took everyone a while to sort of come to know his story. Now we have a photograph from the canonization where a bunch of priests went out to Monk's Lagoon, and I understand that you're in that picture.
Yeah, I'm the one getting my feet wet there. Actually, that's when we're leaving, and the Archbishop of Finland is casting off from Monk's Lagoon to go back to the catamaran that had brought us there. The Archbishop of New York, Metropolitan Irene, is sitting there next to him, and me and my friend Ted Basil are giving the captain of the boat a help shoving the skiff off the beach.
So what do you take away from this event?
The canonization of St. Herman was clearly an earth-shaking event in the life of our church, because Alaska itself was kind of off the radar screen. Most of our Orthodox parishes in the lower 48 were founded by immigrants who came across the Atlantic. They had no historical or cultural or ethnic connection to Alaska. So the canonization made Alaska, I would say, almost central to the life of our church for the next decade.
I just have to point this out, as we do have some images here, some icons, and it's too small to see, but there is an image here in the life story of Father Herman where he's healing the sick, and there's a teepee in the background.
Yes, the icon was painted by a German iconographer. Apparently, most Germans think that all Native Americans live in teepees. And
Even
carved
those
totem
in
poles.
Alaska.
Even those in Alaska, so, yes.
So I guess with a saint comes things that are true, things that maybe you wish were true.
And things that are simply distortions in people's imagination. That's true, all of that comes together.
But apparently, Father Herman opened the door to other saints in Alaska.
Oh, absolutely. With him was Father Juvenali, who was martyred at Quinahawk during the 1790s already. Soon after him came John Veniaminoff, who becomes St. Innocent, the first bishop of Alaska. And his colleague, Father Yakov Nesviatov, the first Aleut priest from St. George Island. But Father Herman's the first and the most special, I think.
No, and it's interesting that we have Alaska Native saints.
Yes.
And probably, you know, in other cultures, other religions, you don't see something like that.
Well, from the very beginning, Father Juvenali had a guide whose name we don't know, but who was martyred with him. An Athabascan, I'm guessing from either Eklutna or Tyonek, but someplace close to Anchorage. And then Father Nesviatov was a seminary graduate and a theologian who served as a missionary for almost 40 years and died in Sitka and is buried there. So yeah, we have a remarkable record. Now we have Matushka Olga from Kwethluk being considered for glorification as a saint, which really means that the church will set aside a day on which to remember them.
You know, a lot of people think that saints are something from the Middle Ages.
I think saints are very relevant for us today. We need a sense of holiness. In our overly secular and business-like world, we lose sight of what Monk's Lagoon represents, a reality, a presence that goes beyond words.
You know, I have to think about what it would have been like to have known Father Herman, St. Herman, because he sounded like kind of an extreme guy. Apparently he only wore like a deerskin shirt, never covered for the cold, sleeping on a board or covering himself with a board,
yes,
with a blanket.
Both, yes.
This guy seems pretty extreme to me.
Well, if you went to some Orthodox monasteries in Russia at that same time, and even to some extent to today, now that there's been a revival of Orthodoxy in Russia with the collapse of the communist regime, you would find hundreds, if not thousands, of similar ascetics today.
What is the value of these ascetics that pray? I mean, that their mission is in life is to pray.
Well, I think there are people who are born to teach and they become teachers, and people who have talent to sing and they become singers. And then there are people who are born to pray and they become monks.
And what is the value of that?
Well, I don't know that it has to have a secular value in dollars and cents or even sociologically. It's what people feel called to do with their lives, to connect this world with heaven, to connect creation with Creator.
Well, certainly I think people can agree that the world needs prayers more than ever. But
yes, indeed. And most of us neglect that. And so the people of prayer, the monastics on Mount Athos, where they've been praying 1,000 services for 1,000 years.
And we see monks from many faiths.
Yes, exactly.
Praying.
People have dedicated themselves precisely to prayer, which in our day and age is something I think we all need to do more of, and for which they set a higher standard for all of us.
All right, well, I want to thank you, Father Michael Oleksa, and we will continue our conversation on the web. Well, up next, at the Highland Mountain Correctional Center, the power of music.
You are far away, and I will always love you. You
How local musicians have helped inmates compose lullabies for their children, and how it's changed them both.
I love you to the moon and back. I love you to the moon and back. I love you to the moon and back.
Throughout history, churches have used art to keep their teachings alive, and that's been the case for the Holy Family Cathedral in Anchorage.
Beauty is one of those things that draws us to the divine.
Once these stained glass windows were put in place this spring, it changed the atmosphere at this historic Catholic church. Pieces of the past, more than 100 years old, came from an old church in Philadelphia. One of the 6 windows displays Saint Therese of Lisieux, patroness of Alaska. Father Dominic David says the transformation has created a prayerful space and hopes the change will inspire others for years to come.
We're going to see this affecting the little children who are in the pews right now, growing up with these beautiful images and being drawn into them.
Holy Family Cathedral says the windows reflect goodness, truth, and beauty, the foundation of faith. The freedom to raise our children, something women in prison can't do. One of the most painful parts of life behind bars. But the Lullaby Project hopes to heal some of this hurt. A Samoan inmate wrote the words to this lullaby. It's called Angel from Heaven, put to music by a group of local musicians. More than a dozen inmates are part of this project. Their lullabies were recorded this week at Mirror Studios, while at the Highland Mountain Correctional Center, the inmates recorded messages for their children. For most, it was an emotional experience.
And I just want you to know that I took the time to sit down and write you your own lullaby song. And just know I miss you so much.
It was only a few weeks ago that the musicians were paired up with the inmates to help them compose their lullabies.
It's like having women in a kitchen cooking. You know, everybody has a part to put into the meal, and it makes it better.
The songs will be put on CDs to be given to the inmates and their children. Then a community concert will be held at Highland next month. And we'll tell you more about that on our Sunday, September 11th show, which will be dedicated entirely to the Lullaby Project, a partnership between the Keys of Life program and the Carnegie Institute. Well, from music to sacred spaces and places, we hope you've enjoyed this week's show. We'll see you next week.